Xbox has offered a longer deal to PlayStation for Call of Duty, and it doesn't seem like they're going to take it. I think the only thing they want is this deal completely blocked. There's a lot here to talk about, so let's get into it. What is going on, everybody? This is Randall Thor 19, the man with the million, back again with another video. I hope everybody is having a wonderful day. If you guys can do me a huge favor, make sure you hit that like button. Please subscribe if you're new. We're almost at 90,000. And make sure you check out the Patreon for Xbox 2 in the description below. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. Yeah, I know. I'm sure you guys are just as excited as me to talk about yet again, once more, for like the 100th time, the Xbox Activision deal and everything that has gone on lately with it. I really didn't want to make this video, as I'm sure many of you probably don't want to hear about it. Everybody's like, can we just fast forward to early next year, March or April, to find out if this deal's actually going to pass? Or if the regulators are going to sue to block it, forcing Microsoft to either drop it or actually then take those regulators to court. Yes, I know. It was fun at one point when it was Jim Ryan versus Phil Spencer with Microsoft responding back and forth. And then it became a little bit stale. But a lot of people asked me if I was going to talk about this because we have more information, new information from the New York Times and other places that Microsoft is trying to do everything they can to smooth over any issues that regulators have, and that Microsoft is basically trying to give Sony a much larger deal than they gave before. But I think it's pretty apparent to anybody sitting on the sidelines right now that Sony doesn't want any concessions from Microsoft. They don't care if Microsoft's gonna promise them 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or the next 50 years of Call of Duty on PlayStation. I think the only thing that they want is the deal blocked because they are truly scared and frightened of Microsoft owning Activision Blizzard King and having that power of Call of Duty to be able to put on Game Pass. And you know what? I had to make a video because one of my favorite persons in all of gaming, crying, flying, Jim Ryan, tap dancing, saving Private Ryan, came out of his hidey hole to give us another excellent quote that we're going to have to talk about. Now, first off, before we get into the New York Times article, I want to rewind the clock to just last week, when head of Xbox Phil Spencer was on the Verge podcast talking about many different topics. I didn't cover it, but I did talk about it on the Xbox 2 podcast. But I'm just going to go over a little bit what he said about Call of Duty here and how it applies to what's going on today. So, Phil said, quote, "This idea that we would write a contract that says the word forever in it, I think, is a little bit silly. But to make a longer-term commitment that Sony would be comfortable with, that regulators would be comfortable with, I have no issue with that at all." You see, when Microsoft first made that offer to PlayStation, that they were going to get 3 years beyond the current contract, which ends in 2024, that's when all the juicy stuff started coming out. That's when Jim Ryan started coming out and saying the offer was inadequate. You have to think about PlayStation gamers and all that bullshit that Jim Ryan was spewing back in October. A lot of people were said, well, Phil Spencer is just saying whatever he wants to say. He's lying, because if they were truly never going to get rid of Call of Duty from PlayStation, they would just offer Sony a contract that said you can have it forever. But that's not how businesses work. But in business, you're not going to give anybody a contract that says forever. But Microsoft clearly wants this deal to get done. They offered Sony a 3-year deal. Jim Ryan was like, it's inadequate on every single level. We have to have something longer. And Microsoft said that, hey, to appease Sony, to appease the regulators, we might offer a longer contract. Attempting to clarify that there were no tricks or loopholes to a statement, Spencer added, quote, "We think Call of Duty will be on PlayStation as long as players want to play Call of Duty on PlayStation. And that's not a competitive threat against PlayStation. That's just a pragmatic way of looking at it." And when the podcast host appeared to start suggesting that Xbox could get around this by offering a streaming-only version on PlayStation, Spencer quickly interrupted to clarify, quote, "Native Call of Duty on PlayStation, not linked to them having to carry Game Pass. See, even the host of these podcasts, when you look at these interviews that I've dissected in the past, there's always some wiggle room. Well, you could do this, you might do this, or you're not being truthful. And Phil pretty much stamped that out, being like, listen, there's no loopholes, there ain't no tricks. This is straight up native version of Call of Duty on PlayStation. Phil continued to say, quote, if they want a streaming version of Call of Duty, we could do that as well, just like we do on our own consoles. There's nothing behind my back. Continuing to clarify further, Spencer added, it is the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, doing great on PlayStation, doing great on Xbox, the next game, the next game, the next, native on PlayStation, not having to subscribe to Game Pass. Sony does not have to take Game Pass on their platform to make that happen. There's nothing hidden. We want to continue to ship Call of Duty on PlayStation without any kind of weird, aha, I figured out the gotcha. And this has been pretty apparent since the actual acquisition of Activision back on January 18th. A couple days after that date, Microsoft said that they talked to leaders at Sony. They want to keep it on their platform. They've been pretty open, saying they want to treat it like Minecraft. They want more people to play Call of Duty, not less. Right? And they even talked about bringing it to the Nintendo Switch. So here you have it. Phil saying, listen, we will give a longer deal to appease regulators and Sony. There's no things behind my back. It's just straight up what we're doing. But Sony doesn't care, and that's what we're going to get to here. Sony wants this deal completely and utterly blocked, and they think they have a good chance of that actually happening, considering you have the CMA and the EU kind of parroting their responses to the Brazilian Commission. All right, so we're caught up to present time. We're going to be talking about the New York Times article, and I cannot wait to dig into this and see what my buddy, what Jim Ryan has to say about all of this. So the New York Times says that Microsoft has been less successful in neutering opposition from Sony, which makes the PlayStation console. Sony has argued that Microsoft could pull Call of Duty from PlayStation to lure players to Xbox. Well, the thing is, they don't want to remove Call of Duty from PlayStation. In fact, they want to bring it. Microsoft has been very upfront about Call of Duty not leaving PlayStation, so I find it exceedingly hilarious that one of the arguments Sony's trying to make to regulators is that they could do this when it's been pretty apparent from the get-go that they aren't going to do it. But I understand why, because you have to present that to regulators if you're trying to get them concerned and try to get them to block this deal in your favor. Microsoft has denied that it would do that, of course. Quote, the first call Satya and I made after the deal was announced was to the CEO of Sony to say, hey, we're going to keep Call of Duty on your platform, said Phil Spencer, Microsoft's gaming chief. But you see, Sony was not appeased. In filings in Brazil, the company argued that Call of Duty was such a powerful game franchise that Microsoft could use it to hurt rivals. It hired a consulting firm to set up meetings on Capitol Hill, two people familiar with the matter said, and its arguments were repeatedly cited in a decision by Britain's regulator in September to pursue a deeper investigation. Yes, we all remember the PlayStation arguments in the Brazilian Commission. They basically were saying that Call of Duty is the biggest thing in gaming, that they couldn't really exist without it, and all that stupid stuff that they were saying. The idea that PlayStation, the #1 market leader, the company that just put out God of War Ragnarok with 94 meta that is probably selling incredibly well. You mean to tell me that that company, the one that is head and shoulders above Xbox, is, if they were to lose Call of Duty completely, that they would be completely destroyed? No, of course they wouldn't be. Sure, their bank accounts would take a hit, but they would be fine. In fact, I think they would probably still beat Xbox, because people still look at Xbox as a joke most of the time. They look at what happened last generation with the Xbox One, and they didn't like what was going on then, and Xbox has spent that entire time trying to rebuild trust with consumers. You don't even need an Xbox to play Xbox games. You can play all their exclusives on mobile phones, tablets, on your PC, and soon to be your TV without a console. So the idea that if PlayStation lost Call of Duty, it would be so detrimental to their business is just absolutely absurd. New information: they hired a consulting firm to set up meetings on Capitol Hill because I think they knew from the beginning that they had a chance to try to block this if they could, well, mislead or at least not tell the whole truth to these regulators. Because let's be honest, these regulators probably know nothing about the video game industry. And wouldn't you know it, Microsoft accused Sony of misleading the regulators, saying, it, quote, overstated the importance of Call of Duty to its viability. And I think anybody with a brain would realize that Microsoft is right and that Sony was completely exaggerating to the point of being misleading. And here is where my dude enters the story finally. In a statement, Jim Ryan, the chief executive of Sony Interactive Entertainment, says it was not true that his company had misled regulators. He said that Microsoft was, quote, a tech giant with a long history of dominating industries, and that, quote, it is highly likely that the choices gamers have today will disappear if this deal goes ahead. Oh man, you can always count on Jim Ryan for a good quote filled with complete nonsense and bullshit. So, of course, he's going to come out and say that it's not true we've misled regulators, we may have exaggerated, but it's definitely not true. And then he went into, hey, you know what? You remember when Microsoft was a tech giant back in the 90s? They dominated all these fields of industry, and you guys had to sue him. Yeah, he's fear-mongering a little bit there, but also, even by saying that, even by bringing up the fact that Microsoft was a tech giant with a long history of dominating industries, he's implicitly implying that if this deal were to go through, that Microsoft would then come to dominate the video game industry. Not be #1 and just knock off PlayStation, but completely dominate. Those are Jim Ryan's words, and you have to read in between the lines, because he's telling regulators, he's telling the press, he's reminding everybody of Microsoft's long history of dominating industries. And how that applies to gaming is, well, Microsoft is about to make a $70 billion purchase with Activision Blizzard. So he's trying to correlate the two by saying if they were allowed to get this, they're going to dominate video games and maybe make it bad for consumers like they made it bad for consumers in the 90s when you guys had to sue them. So Jim Ryan doesn't have any confidence in his product is basically what he's saying. That if Microsoft were to get Call of Duty and King and Blizzard, PlayStation's business would be completely destroyed almost. And that consumers would pay the price, because he goes on to say that it's highly likely the choices gamers have today will disappear. What exactly does this even mean? What choices do people have today that would completely disappear? Are suddenly Microsoft going to remove the ability to buy Call of Duty for $70 or $60? Highly unlikely. Is Microsoft going to actually remove Call of Duty from some of these platforms? Are they going to remove Call of Duty from PC? Absolutely not. Are they going to remove Call of Duty from PlayStation? Hell, we haven't even gotten to the part where Microsoft offered a new 10-year deal to PlayStation. It's vitally important to the economics of this deal that it stays on PlayStation. They even talked about bringing Call of Duty to more platforms like the Switch. And you're probably even going to have Call of Duty on iOS and mobile. So I struggle to think what choices gamers have today. As a consumer today, the choices I have and how to engage in my video games, what choices is Jim Ryan talking about that will completely disappear? Maybe I'm just not smart enough, but I don't see it. But of course, you're Jim Ryan. What have you done that is very consumer-focused, consumer-friendly with your market leader position outside of using it to prevent games from releasing on Xbox and Nintendo Switch, or raising the price of first-party games from $60 to $70 and having the entire industry follow your lead? Or even the unthinkable, something that's never happened before, raising the price of your console. These are things that you're currently doing that nobody's really talking about, and yet your quote is about a hypothetical situation drawing parallels to when Microsoft was a completely different company with completely different goals, saying that if this were allowed to happen, consumers would be hurt because their choices will be eliminated, but you can't even mention or say what said choices would be gone? That's because when Jim Ryan talks, it's just diarrhea spewing from his mouth. It doesn't really mean anything, and it just stinks. And then finally, we have Microsoft said that on November 11th, it offered Sony a 10-year deal to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation, and that Sony declined to comment on the offer. Of course they declined to comment on the offer, because the one thing that Sony wants out of all this is the deal to get completely blocked. When Microsoft offered that 3-year contract to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation, Jim Ryan said it was inadequate. So okay, here's a 10-year deal, 7 more years, basically bringing the deal to 2034. Who knows what the next 10 years looks like? I don't even know if I'll be alive in the next 10 years, for Christ's sake. But here you go, another 10 years, and then you could do another deal. But you see, it's not about length of contract for Sony, because Sony knew from the very get-go, from the very beginning, that Microsoft wasn't going to remove Call of Duty from PlayStation. They knew this. Jim Ryan knew this. What they were trying to do from the very start was exaggerate the importance of Call of Duty to their businesses, to convince regulators that Microsoft's the bad guy by revisiting their history in the 90s and saying how this is bad for consumers, even though offering Call of Duty for really cheap on Game Pass and all these extra places is actually really good. But it's in Sony's best interest for a first-party console manufacturer to not own Call of Duty. So their goal has been from the very beginning to get this deal blocked, or maybe get a concession along the lines of, yes, you can purchase Activision Blizzard, but you cannot put Call of Duty in Game Pass. And if you put Call of Duty in Game Pass, you might also have to put it in PlayStation Plus. But what Sony's truly angling here for is to completely block the deal. I think Sony thinks they have a really good chance to convince some of these regulators that Microsoft owning Activision Blizzard and having complete control of Call of Duty is not only bad for Sony, but because it's bad for Sony, it's actually bad for consumers. These are the arguments we've seen the CMA talk about. So I don't think there's any concessions that PlayStation is willing to entertain from Xbox regarding Call of Duty. They're probably all in on blocking this deal, and they're going to use Microsoft's history against them by reminding everybody just what they did in the 90s and how anti-consumer they were. And if they did get that powerful and they did ruin the gaming industry, then the choices that consumers have now would completely go away. I don't know what's going to happen in the long run with this deal. I still think it closes, but I think it's clear to me and to everybody by now, Sony has one agenda on the table, and that's to try and block this deal no matter the cost. And maybe you gotta hand it to them. Maybe their lawyers are doing a better job at convincing regulators that this deal is bad for everybody versus Microsoft's lawyers trying to convince the regulators that the video game industry is this dynamic place where everyone can thrive. So we'll just have to wait and see what comes out of this. I wonder if Microsoft's going to respond, because that Jim Ryan quote is certainly something. And a 10-year deal from Microsoft to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation to 2034, but no comment by Sony yet, when last time they said it was completely inadequate? Yeah, I think we know what their true intentions are right now, don't we? Anyways, guys, that's the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new. Check out the Patreon in the description for the Xbox 2 podcast. Make sure you hit that notification bell, and please share this out on social media. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video. Later.